for joining us today, for inviting me to come from Belgium. By training, yes. Well, anyone who flies, I once flew from the UK to the UK, but it's absurd anyway. It takes too much time. Okay, so here's the roadmap. So, excuse me, you want to put the whole thing up? Sure.
But when you come past this bit,
Okay. So, I just want to give a brief overview of what I want to talk about today. So first, this question, should artists have to do anything? I mean, I think we're at a really interesting crossroads where more and more artists are taking on these issues, and some artists are like, hey, I just want to make stripe paintings, or hey, I just want to work with a form. And that's a real question. Do we really put pressure on artists to do what they can to work with issues that are really important, or do we start to think in the way that we have a plurality of ideas, and instead of a kind of obligation? And I think in England, especially with Claire Bishop, you already have this built-in resistance against forcing artists to do things like this. Okay, so it's true. She's the leading proponent that artists should be able to do whatever they like. Okay, so artistic strategies, I'm going to talk about that in a second. How can art positively impact the Anthropocene? I'm going to give lots of examples. Why do eco-interventions work? I'll tell you a little bit about eco-interventions, what can we learn from eco-artists, why human beings cannot escape the Anthropocene. I think one of the things that upsets me or worries me the most are all these images of Mars. I like to think, oh no, we came from Mars. We already were there. Rachel.
Can you use the mic?
Okay, sorry. Okay, so I like to think that we came from Mars. I think that's the healthiest way to live on this planet, because if we have the view that we can go to Mars, I think we're doomed. And how do philosophy, science, and art intersect? And I want to focus on ecosystem functioning. I know in the UK you guys focus a lot on ecosystem servicing, but I think that's really problematic. Okay. So now back to this, the one over here. Let's see, how do we make this bigger? Is it big enough? Maybe it's big enough. Okay. Anyway, if you've taken a sculpture class, I'm sure you know this, this graph. It's very famous in sculpture. And it's from the late 70s, I think 77 is when she made it. And she was trying to make a comment about what was happening. Rosenkranz is the she. Rosenkranz was trying to make an analysis of what was happening in sculpture. And so sculpture would be like at the bottom is the monument. And at the time, you know, there's people with Richard Long, for example. He would be a marked site. An axiomatic structure would be like something built in the space, and then a site construction. But she was trying to sort of say that right now we have all of sculpture that's not a monument or that's not self-contained, that's in the outdoors, is either landscape or architecture, or landscape and not architecture, or not architecture. But the point being that she found that she could map all of the current art practice or sculpture practices using this graph. But immediately, as soon as I came into the art world, I was like, there's a huge problem with this graph. It doesn't include what I would call living sculptures. And by living sculpture, I mean art that involves plants. She had, even though at the time, it's 1977, there were already fantastic examples of artists like Hans Hocke's, his mound of grass. There were already plenty of artists using natural materials or living, growing materials in their art, but they don't fit on her graph. Okay, so now, let's see. Okay, now we can get rid of this. Oh, I guess I put it in first. Okay, this one. Yeah, everything is cool, but it has that, doesn't it?
I can't see it.
It's not on the, all right. All right.
There's never a seamless tech.
Okay, so this is me trying to map the debate about whether artists should do anything or not. And so it's sort of color-coded. Green are the people that are really supporting artists or encouraging artists to only take on political, ecological, timely issues. And the red are the people resisting it. And I can give you the PowerPoint if you want. I'm just saying you don't have to take photos. If you want, you can, but I'm just saying I'm happy to share all of this information. So you can see I'm sort of implicated in the debate because even as early as '95, I'm really focused on, at the time, 1995, I do my first exhibition of participatory art. And it doesn't really have anything to, it's really more about engaging spectators and making spectators active in a museum site. So it doesn't really have anything to do with timely ecological issues, for example. But I'm just trying to say I'm complicit in the debate. I don't really know that I have never, even though I work mostly with ecological artists, I always try to say I make room for stripe painters or whatever, because for me, art is the cornerstone of freedom, and if we start dictating how artists make art, I think we're really going to be in a bad space. But I think it's great to find the artists that you endorse and work with them and support them. Okay, so anyway, this is just a debate about, this is just a mapping of this debate about whether artists should have to do anything. And I think that, back to Claire Bishop, it became crucial in the UK because I think that there was some relationship between funding only going to artists who did things on behalf of the state. And I think that Claire's point in that case is really well taken because you don't really want to have art in the service of the state. The state has certain obligations and commitments, and I think it actually is interesting when artists demonstrate that the state has failed or the state has not has not done what they're supposed to do. There's a really good example where the Assemble their project was in Liverpool, right? Okay, are you familiar with this project? Okay, everyone knows, some people know. So Assemble is a British architecture firm based in London, I believe. And they got money to do a project working with the people in Liverpool. Is it Liverpool or Sainsbury? Liverpool, to rehab houses. But anyway, one of the things I think is really interesting, a little detail, is in that case the people approached Assemble. It's not that Assemble was hired by the state. So I think that's really interesting. To me, that's a very important detail that, in fact, the citizens of the community were like, okay, the state has failed us. No one cares what, they boarded up all these homes. They have no plan to, for 25 years we lived with this mess. It's just getting worse. How do we initiate something on our own? I think that's a very important solution, and that, I don't know what Claire Bishop thinks about it, but in my mind that really distinguishes it from the examples that she uses where she thinks that the artists are complicit with the state's negligence. Okay, so now the next one. How do I go forward? Oh, maybe go here. I hit this. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so in order to sort of make a diagram that I thought that the entire art world could use, and go further than Rosalind Krauss's one from 30 years ago, and could really start to talk about what I think is happening in the art world. I made this one called The Artistic Strategies Diamond of Opposition. And it's actually really simple. So everything on the top half of the diamond takes place in the real world. So all sorts of interventions, the Occupy movement, Yes Man, anything that happens outside of the art world. So if it's a documenta, I would put it at the bottom half of even if it's an ecological intervention that's associated with documenta or Venice Biennale, I would put it at the bottom half, and I'll tell you why, because I think there's a huge difference. It turns out that there's a huge difference when artists' audiences are the unwitting public and when artists' audiences are the art world. I mean, they just function differently. So then if you divide, so that's the top and the bottom. The top is the real world, the bottom is the artistic world, or the art world. Then on the right-hand side are actions that are actions, and on the left-hand side are situations. And I really have a very simple distinction. Situations are done without a purpose, without a goal. So it's open-ended. Things that are open-ended, things that artists just want to try something, they don't really know how it's going to go out, it's going to happen, whereas actions are more purposeful. So it's a strategy, it's just to, with a goal in mind. And it doesn't, but obviously every action done with a goal in mind doesn't turn out the way the artist anticipated it, right? So they are always in the end open, but the decisions are made, the action is made with a goal to do something. Okay, so, and then the ones that are in the real world that are actions, I call practical actions, and the ones that are in the real world that are situations and more open-ended, I call those social, and the ones that are in the art world but are situations I call conceptual, like conceptual art, and then the last bit is political art. And I sort of made, like I said, I made this diamond to sort of let every artist find their way. And I think what's also important is that sometimes artists do, a great example is the artist who, Sam Durant. When Sam Durant moved his sculpture, I don't know if you followed this huge controversy, when he moved a sculpture that had been a documenta, I think it was also viewed in the UK. I think it was, anyway, he moved it from the art world to a public sculpture park and caused all sorts of problems because all of a sudden the audience changed. And I think that this diamond, this way of thinking, can also help us try to understand who is our audience. If our audience is the real world, and we made something for the art world, it's obvious when we move it to the real world, we're going to have different conditions and different assumptions. Anyway, okay, so the reason I also have these diagonals like she does is because I feel like you can flip. And Niels Norman is a great example. In my mind, Niels is always flipping between conceptual art and practical art. You know, some things he does, Niels Norman is a British artist, and oftentimes, like early in his career, he always was talking about utopia, and he had no desire at all to make things. He only had a desire to change people's minds. And so on that level, it really wasn't in the real world, it was in the artist's world. And I think he felt like he had a lot more freedom, but more recently, he's actually making things. Okay, so how can art positively impact the Anthropocene? So I'm going to give examples in these 8 different categories. I mean, these categories are just categories I'm using. They could be, I'm sure you guys have other categories. This is not the definitive list by any means, but it's just a way to understand, to frame how some artists are acting. So activism, valuing anew. For me, valuing anew is when an artist says that something doesn't need to be changed. It's okay the way it is, because that's a huge important artistic role. Everyone wants to make everything perfect and beautiful and take it back to an original spot, but that's almost always impossible, and it almost always ignores what life is already there. So a lot of artists do that. Biodiversity is artists bringing attention to issues of species loss, urban infrastructure, restoration, reclamation, food security, climate change, and echoes. Okay, so activism. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So Laura Amolsegai she's a Spanish artist living in the Netherlands, and she has been, she works in the field of wastelands. She's, you invite her to a city, she'll document all your wastelands, but she's also managed to, protect wastelands. So spaces that people would automatically want to restore or develop or change because they're an eyesore, she's managed to not only protect them so no one can develop them, but draw attention to them by putting a sign next to it and saying, this wasteland is protected. So that's how, so it's a little bit of value new and a little bit of activism. And then Cecilia Malik is a Polish artist who works, this project here was restricting development so that there wouldn't, to preserve the migration of a European butterfly. Here she spent about 2 years rowing around the hidden rivers of Krakow and then making a movie about them. And this is one of her actions against, in favor of purified water. I mean, she works on almost every different topic, but these are just some examples. Valuing anew, so I don't know if you guys know Lois Weinberger, but this is a project, he's been doing these gardens all around the world where he just gathers, like, I said all around the world, but I should have said all around Europe. He gathers soil in buckets and then allows the buckets, so when they arrive they look totally, actually it's more important than that, it's poor, what he calls poor soil. So it's soil that might come from a construction site or might come from someone's backyard, but some sort of soil that people think is dead, and then by collecting them and letting the things grow, it shows people that actually this soil that they always think is dead is really alive. Here's another one of Laura Armosagai's wastelands that's protected. This one is in the Netherlands. And this is the Smithson piece, Broken Circle, Spiral Hill, that's also in the Netherlands. And you might ask, well, how is Broken Circle, Spiral Hill, why is that like just land art? How could that be either ecological or value anew? But I think one of the things that's really interesting is it's in a quarry, and the people that own it are very open to having people come to visit it. So it brought tons of people to look at an industrial site that would normally, like people are going in search of art, but they find this industrial site as well. But there's two other details I think are really interesting. I think that because they've had this artwork for 40 years, they've made their lands more, the migration, you can see birds everywhere. I think that it made the people that own the land, instead of thinking it just as an industrial site, it made them more conscious of their land and how it was being used by people other than their business. And secondly, the quarry is going to run out of sand. And the next question is what's going to happen with this quarry and how will it be, what's its future? And there was an article in the New York Times, I think January last year, that said that the space was for sale. I don't know if it's true, but it's kind of interesting to imagine, will someone like Ursula Hauser buy it as a land art, or will it become a development space? But I think at least it's going to raise these questions because it's been sitting there for 40 years and people are more conscious of the land and how it's being used. Okay, so this is biodiversity, and there's 3 projects here that are worth talking about. This is from Herman de Vries, and he had a really interesting, he was asked to do a public artwork, and he's like, well, okay, what can I do? But it was a new town, so he decided to line every street with every street in the new town with the same tree. So there's 400 new streets, and each street got a bunch of trees. There's 400, it's kind of like a city as an arboretum. But what's interesting, so I went there to see it myself, and I was asking people like, oh, how do you like living in this arboretum? And it's so cool, all the same trees on one street. The people living there, of course, had never noticed it. It's kind of sad on that level. But I think as a kind of a public artwork where an artist gets to think about what it's like to live in a new city. I mean, new cities are infamous for having, even new developments, all those are infamous for having really terrible tree situations. I mean, they sort of just mow down the forest and put the houses in. So anyway, I think it's an interesting solution. And you can see it took a long time, 96 to 2008. The Harrison Studio project was an interesting one. So this is the famous the Green Heart of the Netherlands. So they were invited to do an ecological proposal. And they came up with this way to, the Netherlands wanted to add something like 150,000 new homes. So the question was, what is the best way to add new homes? So they suggested that if this green circle, the green heart, could be kept intact as a kind of lung, then you could add the houses somehow within this space, and then it wouldn't be as environmentally damaging. And they got this term, the green heart, from actually a pilot, a KLM pilot from the 30s. When he flew over the Netherlands, he could look down and he would say, oh, by chance that they've created this green heart connecting all the main cities of the Netherlands. And this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Brendan Ballinger, but he's an American artist, and he's also got a PhD in biology, and he goes around the world doing these, he calls them the malformed amphibian counts. And when he did one in the Netherlands, he discovered the worst situation he ever had. It's usually like 5 to 10% of the amphibians have multiple legs, but in this case it was sort of like 95%. But what's good is that because he's a scientist, then he can publish his papers and he can influence the community on that, influence two communities. One is the community, the art world, where he does these projects with citizen scientists, and then the other is the science world, which may not be, for whatever reason, so interested to do these species counts. All right, I know these slides are really jam-packed, but, okay. So, in this case, Deborah Solomon is doing a really interesting project. She is she does agroforestry, but she's doing an agroforestry project in a city in North Amsterdam. I'm sure some of you have been to North Amsterdam. It's the part where you have to take the little boat to where the eye is. If you've been to the new movie museum, it's really close to there. But it's kind of amazing because agroforestry, first of all, it's brand new. Well, it's not brand new, but it's pretty new. Last year I was in Germany working on a project, and we had artists doing agroforestry, and it seemed like it was even new in Germany, which surprised me. But anyway, but in a weird way, it's the most perfect future for a city, right? Because you have trees, you can prevent warming, you can make food. It covers lots of bases, but you have to really know what you're doing, because otherwise it's not so easy to do agroforestry. But anyway, so this is her project, Urbanihove, and N55 is from Denmark, and they do tons of projects that really look more like, oftentimes people say, oh gosh, now I'm lost. Okay, oftentimes and if you go on their website, you can find all sorts of amazing designs. But people often say, oh, it really looks like design, it doesn't look like art. But they totally come out of the art world. And for me, one of the best ways to know the distinction between design and art is usually design. Design has different kinds of commitments than artworks do. Artworks can be made just to test something out. And what's interesting to me about artists, when they do design, for example, they normally make both the alpha test and the beta test, and they make it themselves and they test it themselves. Whereas people that claim to be designers, well, not claim, but self-identify as designers, they don't really have to test their designs. They can make a design, let someone else test it, they can make a design. So there's, for me, artists have a different way of being. First of all, they can make something that's just a one-off, and maybe it fails, but a designer can't make something that fails, right? So you have, anyway, I'm just saying that even though it looks like design, so this is in particular, this is meant to be like a modular city where all of these parts are made individually, and then you bring them together and you make this a modular space in a city. And in this particular case, this was a project for, I believe it's for Den Haag with Marietje Potrich, where they were given a public space and they were asked to make something that could bring people together. So they took, this building is by the famous Dutch architect Karl Oud, I think, O-U-D, and they took the footprint of the building and made then a platform for discussion in a park. But anyway, I think urban infrastructure, it doesn't look very ecological. I mean, it doesn't maybe look so obviously ecological, but since we recognize cities as ecologically efficient and they're often missing nature and they need more nature and they need more space for, they need more green space, they need more people, places, social spaces, I think it's a very important role that artists have played in creating this urban infrastructure. And I just want to say one more point. So you might ask, well, why is Deborah Solomon's food forest in urban infrastructure instead of food security, for example, right? But that it's really interesting to me because when I work on these categories and I work on my books and I interview the artists, I try to figure out, like, what is it that they're trying to tackle? And in Deborah's case, she really does want us to rethink our cities. She's not really trying to say, hey, look, you can be an agroforester. If she were doing that, she probably would do a project more in a forest, you know, in a more remote place. But she's really tackling having people rethink the city and rethink the possibility of the city. Because it's true that only 100 years ago, cities created all their food within the cities. In fact, Paris was a net exporter of fruit to England at the turn of the century. But they were creating all of the fruits and vegetables that they needed in their cities. And of course, that's been lost with thanks to the train and everything else. Okay. So restoration reclamation. There's in Europe, you know, in the States, there's many more cases of this than there are in Europe, and I tried to figure out why is it that European artists are so shy when it comes to restoration. But I think one of the things I realized is that in the States, there's a much more honest. The government's always like, we have no money, we don't have any resources, we know we should do something, but we don't know what to do. So when the artist says, oh, I have an idea I'd like to try, then the city is like, oh, that would be incredible, wow, that would be so great. So they're not really threatened by it because they know they're understaffed and under-resourced. But I think from my experience in the Netherlands, not in UK because I've never worked in the UK, but what I learned working in the Netherlands is that the state wants their citizens to believe that they've got everything under control and that they're tackling everything and that they're really 100% on it. So when an artist comes and says, hey, you know, the river here is terribly dirty, I have a strategy for how to clean it, the state doesn't really want the artist to be exposing or to be playing that role. So I think the reason why there's less restoration and reclamation projects in Europe is because the state is a lot stronger in Europe in terms of the ecological protection. But anyway, maybe I'm wrong. But in this particular case, in the Netherlands is sinking because they removed all of their peat. And so now they removed the peat to make farmland. And now there's a new way of thinking where they are they're taking a lot of their farms and turning them into wetlands. So this is another project from Herman de Vries where he created an entire idea of, he created this is like a plant list of how to plant the plants to turn a farmland into a wetland so that they can get more peat back and have less damage to the soil. This is a project in Liverpool too. This is a British artist, Rebecca Chesney. And this is not really necessarily a reclamation restoration. Well, it's a restoration project for sure. So as you know, we used to have plenty of meadows, and meadows have been taken away for housing, for development, for all these kinds of things. So there's a lot of artists already for 30 years have been planting meadows and have been either planting them or, for example, Herman de Vries has a meadow by having bought the property of land next to him and protecting it from development. So the three ways artists make meadows is they either make the meadow from scratch, they buy an existing meadow or find a way to protect an existing meadow, or they move meadows. The Harrison Studios has notoriously moved meadows that were collected all over Germany, and they moved them to a park in Bonn to sort of as meadow advocates or something. But anyway, in this particular case, Rebecca Chesney grew this meadow from scratch with the yellow flowers and the blue flowers. But what was amazing about this meadow, well, first of all, it's already from 2012. The first year, everything came in sync. So she had a blue patch and a yellow patch. And it's actually called I'm Blue, I'm Yellow. It has a nice title. But now it's a little bit out of sync. It's the yellow plants come in before the blue plants. But what's the most interesting to me, as someone who writes about these kinds of artworks, is that as soon as the meadow was functioning and the bees and all the insects were coming around, She worked with two biologists who could identify which kinds of plants the bees, the different kinds of bees and the different kinds of insects were attracted to. So she actually was able to create data, and I think it's really interesting that, you know, no one who's in the business of making meadows would think to make a blue meadow and a yellow meadow, and so probably there's very few meadows. Actually, I do know of a German horticulture program that has set up these kind of artificial meadows to test this. But outside of a horticultural lab, you probably don't have that many people testing which kinds of flowers attract which kinds of insects. So anyway, and then at the bottom here, it's not very clear, is, I don't know if you're familiar with Mel Chin, but he did this project in the States called Revival Field. Did anyone hear of this project? Anyway, so he had 96 different samples. There were heavy metals buried in the soil, and he planted 96 different plants to see which of them would be the best metal uptakers. And this is a recreation of this project in the Netherlands. So this is the I think this is the garden that he made to do the lab project again. Oh, excuse me, it's here. This is his redo of the Revival Field in the Netherlands. It was a temporary project, but the good thing about it is that it sort of jump-started the whole program of phytoremediation. So using plants to take out metals and uptake. That was when he did Revival Field, I think between 90 and 92. No one was talking about phytoremediation, and now it's a huge business. But also on top of that, in retrospect, we now know that Boyce must have known about phytoremediation too. Okay. So food security. My favorite project in the world is Paul Cheney's project of living off the land for 8 years. So this was in Cornwall, nearby. He and his girlfriend at the time, Kenna Hernley, they got a blank piece of land, and Paul developed some sort of computer program where you put in your diet, and it tells you exactly how many plants you need to grow, how much you're going to use to build your house, how much you're going to build to keep warm in the winter, how much you're going to build for composting purposes, how much you're going to build, what you need to feed your animals if you have animals. And they literally lived like this for 8 years. No TV. I think they had internet. Probably they had a Wi-Fi connection. I'm not going to say they didn't. I don't know. I don't know if I asked that. But it really impresses me because we have all these artists like Chris Burden, for example, who supposedly lived in a locker for 3 weeks. I think to myself, living off the land for 8 years in the 21st century is the endurance experience of a lifetime. And so what you see in the image of Paul down here is he made, in some sort of museum in Cornwall, he found this antique farming tool and he transformed it so that it would, do I have 12 minutes left? Or 17? Are you worried about time?
No, 10.
Oh, 10, okay, fine, it's fine, perfect. Okay. So he transformed it so that when he does labor in the land, it would measure how many calories he's burning, right? Because in addition to what your diet is, if you're working all day in the land, you're burning lots of calories. So you have to even eat more than the average person living in the city. So anyway, I think it's a very interesting project. It took place here in the southeast corner of the UK, and he's a great British artist. Very underknown, very underappreciated. This is a project from Niels Norman, a more famous one, but this is in the Netherlands, in Den Haag, where he worked with the kind of farming that starts with a P.
Permaculture.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. He worked with local permaculture farmers to build a permaculture garden, and this is like in a major city park. And then above here is another project with Mariette Potrich and Uz, where they're doing community gardens and then enjoying the food. Now, one of the things that became has been obvious to me is that climate change is such a big project. It's very difficult for artists to sort of come up with a climate change project and tackle it on their own. But it's interesting that at the same time, artists are trying to figure out ways to do that. So in this particular case, this is Soren Dahlgaard, who was living in the Maldives for many years. And the Maldives, of course, is at risk of rising oceans, and so he's made this sort of traveling island. The island travels in a suitcase. The sculpture, you put it together by putting it with a van of some sort, and then there's an exhibition inside that has everything to do with climate change. And this is another case. This is a project that's very similar to the Herman de Vries wetland project, except for they did it to tackle climate change. So they proposed to the Netherlands that they turn more farms into wetlands with the idea to cool the airspace as opposed to using it for farmland. Okay, so those are, and now the last project is Ecos. These are British artists, Touchstone. They did, this is in London on the Southwark Bridge, they did a ritual, what they call ritual mayonnaise, where they teach people, they show people or they encourage people to make homemade mayonnaise as a group with the idea that they can appreciate that it's the oil and the eggs and everything. And they did this on the bridge, it's called Southwark, right? Southwark? The bridge, the footbridge that connects the Thames. This is Teresa Murrick, who spent a month massaging the sourdough into the soil, but the result was fantastic. Not the immediate result of the soil, but the lake, nearby lake that had been the most polluted lake in Norway is now clean. So did her action lead to the cleanliness, or did her action raise the consciousness that led to the cleanliness? I don't know. And then finally, another great project is the Reductionist Art Manifesto from Kinga Pajinska. So, and she actually lives by this. It's unbelievable. So she has really mapped out how we can live a life and make art and not add anything excessive. Okay, so why do ecoventions work? What can we learn? So what's CPH? CPH is the cognitive perception hypothesis. And that's the idea that, if you come from philosophy, that's the idea that there's some people in philosophy who think that we all perceive things equally, and there's other people that think that we bring a lot more things to perception, whether it's background knowledge, bias, previous experiences. For example, even this is a test that they've done in England, in London, that if you serve someone white wine dyed red, they perceive it as red wine, even if it doesn't really taste like red wine. So there's something that happens in our brain when we have perceptions, right? So the people that accept the cognitive perception hypothesis think that the cognitive states challenge perception. And that's important to me because if art is going to change people, it has to somehow, it can't just be perception, right? Because if it were just perception, then we would all have the similar experiences. But if art is going to change people, you have to somehow figure out how to overcome people's biases, how to overcome their past experiences. You know, everyone is bringing a different body with different embedded cognitions to the experience. So everyone's walking away with a different thing. So the question is, how does art do that? Because it would seem that it would be very difficult to change people's minds. But actually what I've realized is that artists do change people's minds. And what I've decided is that, okay, so let me just read this. So if CPH is true, such that cognitive states causally influence perceptual processing such that they determine subjects' it's hard to read this in, whatever. Maybe I read it here. Okay, so if CPH is true, such that cognitive states causally influence perceptual processing such that they determine subjects' perceptual contents or experiences, as many scientists and environmental estheticians believe, then environmentalists actually face a bigger challenge. And when I say this, is that it's not enough to talk about how we experience. How can those with different beliefs and thoughts be expected to recognize the symptoms of environmental degradation, let alone perceive them as environmentalists do? And I think this is one of the really big reasons why in the States, for example, you can have this climate change hoax, because in fact, people are experiencing their environments differently. I think that some people are sensitive to degradation and other people are just insensitive to it. So with art, we have to get them over this hump, and that's really a big problem. So rather than merely providing more information, getting non-believers to perceive certain symptoms requires also devising strategies that address their values. If CPH is true, information is not enough, since beliefs tend to override scientifically proven facts. And they've also, one of the really two interesting tests that I want to, in the States, they found that the people who don't believe in evolution can explain evolution better than the people that do believe in evolution. And it's the same with carbon dioxide, it's the same with carbon emissions. The people that think that, that carbon, CO2 emissions or greenhouse gases is a hoax, whatever, those same people identify carbon as the culprit, whereas the people that are believers have no clue that it's carbon. Well, not no clue, fewer, that's the point. But the point is so it's not about information. Art has to work on a different level. It's not education, it's not information. And what's interesting to me is recently I went to a philosophy conference where everyone was talking about emotions, and they think that the reason why art penetrates people is that it like opens up this emotional part of people, and then that gives access. But I actually really think that emotions isn't enough. I think that if you really want to study this, you want to look at how art introduces values, and people don't even know they're being exposed to those values. And I think that's the key, that they're seeing the value in action. They don't know that they're exposed to the value. And then, but you can't hit them over the head with the value either. You have to somehow have the value so embedded that people's own curiosity discovers it. Okay, so finally, art prompts people to reconsider personal values and impels actions. I think I haven't done the scientific research has been done on the emotion side, but I think that the key would be to work on the value side. Okay, so why humans cannot escape the Anthropocene. So Yuriko Sato has a very nice idea that we ought to appreciate nature on its own terms. Of course, the question is, what does it mean on its own terms? So appreciating nature on its own terms requires being sufficiently aware of nature's needs that one not only notices but takes action when one recognizes that nature is in harm's way. So one of the ideas I've been working with lately that some people hate, some people like, is this idea of nature's well-being, right? Those are two words that people are like, how can nature, like some people think I'm being metaphorical, and I'm not being metaphorical at all. I think that we need to develop tools where we understand whether nature is in balance, whether, for me, well, if I talked about nature's well-being, for me it's just simply that, that entropy is low, the system isn't changing a lot, and that there's lots of species, and that there's a kind of balance between, and because when the entropy goes high, that's when the invasive species can take root. So nature can really only defend itself when entropy is low. So to me, those would be a kind of, a kind of basic idea to understand nature's well-being and nature's ill-being. But I don't mean it metaphorically. Okay, and I actually think as humans, we have a kind of protectorate. We need to protect or take care of or watch over non-humans. So because I feel like we owe them something on the level that we owe our families and friends, because we're already involved in a long-term, permanent, mutually sustaining relationship with our natural environment. So with the kinship model, inaction risks immoral consequences, even as it grants nature-mind independence. But this model also prevents human beings from exerting control or assuming jurisdiction. So that's the point. We don't get to do what we want. We have to do what nature needs. And obviously, maybe we're not the best judge of that. That's a question. Maybe science isn't the best judge of it. But I think that there are lots of scientists that are trying to create tools to understand, when is nature in balance? When is the system healthy? When is the system not healthy? And that's why I turned to ecosystem functioning instead of ecosystem services. So for me, this is where science, philosophy, and art intersect. So could ecosystem functioning be measured, monitored, observed, perfected, or is this simply a fantasy tool? Excuse me, I made a spelling. But anyway, there's a lot of people that don't trust ecosystem functioning. So ecosystem functioning is not ecosystem servicing, which to my lights justifies human activities to authorities charged with making decisions, but it doesn't inspire humans to modify their behavior. And then there's a variety of ways that scientists evaluate it, and one of them is by using biodiversity counts. All right, so could tasking scientists to evaluate ecosystem functioning be a way to monitor ecosystems? That's a question. Artists who produce ecoventions address nature's well-being, thus linking goals of art, philosophy, and science. And I forgot to mention, an ecovention, that's a term that Amy Lipton and I coined 20 years ago, that was a cross between ecology and invention. And more recently, I've decided that when I created that artistic diamond, I decided that an ecovention is an artist-initiated practical action with ecological intent. Okay. So, thank you.
Thank you.